Hello. Let us resume our lecture and discussion on power by Adrienne Rich. In my previous two lectures, I have mentioned about the backdrop and the conditions why Adrienne Rich has taken Marie Curie as the fundamental focus of this particular poem, Power, and also that how, in a symbolic way, Adrienne Rich has incorporated that what she actually identified in a typical perspectives of patriarchy, that means the condition and the presence of the women, and with a particular reference to the bottle of amber, it has been incorporated that how the females were important, the feminine self is also important in a typical patriarchal setup. So let us continue then with the remaining part of this particular poem. The second section of this particular poem begins with the direct reference to Marie Curie. As I have already mentioned in my past lecture, that who was Marie Curie? Marie Curie was the Nobel laureate, and ultimately you will find that she actually invented the importance of radium, okay, and the radioactivity of radium that actually helped in our society in a greater deal. But ultimately, with the help of that particular kind of powerful instrument, as you can see, Marie Curie actually sacrificed her own life for the betterment of the people. So let us continue this particular section. Here, Rich writes that today I was reading about Marie Curie. So there is a direct referencing of her. She must have known she suffered from radiation sickness. Her body bombarded for years for the element she had purified. So what happens, that if you go through the biographical perspective of this particular reference, you will find that Marie Curie actually, to some extent, sacrificed her own life for the betterment of the people, for the betterment of the society, for the betterment of the world. And ultimately, she couldn't identify that the power that she is gathering within herself regarding the positioning of a female, okay, that particular power that she is getting, that particular power is gradually making her powerless physically, okay, but psychologically and socially she was gradually becoming powerful, that you can see here. So that's why there is a direct reference of this particular thing. Today I was reading about Marie Curie. She must have known she suffered from radiation sickness. You know what is radiation sickness? Because she was working with the radioactive part of radium, and ultimately the sickness that was being present within her. So she must have known she suffered from radiation sickness. Her body bombarded, you see, bombarded. This particular term is very important. Why? Rich is taking this very term because bombarding, this particular term, is always being associated with war fields, you see. So as if you will find that Curie was facing a kind of a battle, you will find that selflessly, okay, in the war or in the battles, the soldiers actually they sacrifice their lives for the betterment of the people. And now you will find here that this very term, the term is taking from the it's a kind of a word that have been used in battlefields, and so the martial term. So her body bombarded for years by the element she had purified. That means the elements, say here radium or any other radioactive parts that she was trying to purify. It is the ironic perspective that that very element is creating harm to her body. Okay, it seems she denied to the end the source of the cataracts on her eyes. What happens, that you are the creator, you are the scientific researcher. So whenever you are in research, say what happens to Marie Curie, that the cataract, cataract is a disease for the eyes, as you can know and you can see. So ultimately, what happens that when she was affected by cataract in her eyes, she couldn't have even thought that ultimately it was a kind of a warning for her that her research, the radioactive radium, it is actually affecting her from inside. So it is a kind of a warning. But ultimately, that she denied to the end the source of the cataract on her eyes. That means she denied that it might have been caused by the radium or the radioactivity or the radiation sickness that is continuously happening to her. And ultimately, what happens that there is a vivid description of what actually happened to her body. Here, Rich says, it seems she denied to the end the source of the cataracts on her eyes. The cracked and suppurating skin. You know what is suppurating? Suppurating means it's a kind of a kind of a uh, wounds that have been created. You know, some juicy parts have been created within the skin, and ultimately it becomes the blisters have been shown there. So the cracked and suppurating skin of her finger ends. So what it gives birth till she could no longer hold a test tube or a pencil. So that is a kind of physical information, a kind of description or biographical references that actually happened to Marie Curie during the later part of her life. And ultimately, we know that she actually died by this particular thing, you see. So that is the second section. And the last section here, Adrienne Rich is pointing that she died a famous woman. Okay, so that is the fundamental thing. The last four lines are very significant and very important. You will find that the same phrases have been repeated here. Here, Rich writes, she died a famous woman, denying her owns. And then again, the repetition is there. Denying her owns came from same source as her power. So ultimately, denying her owns, this particular term is being repeated twice. And these are indicating two different orientations of power. You see that the wounds, she died a famous woman. Now, here you will find the famous woman, the fame is actually being ascribed to the concept of power. He is gradually becoming powerful socially and powerless physically. So, denying her wounds, she died a famous woman. That means she could have thought that ultimately the reactions, the fundamental representations of uh, radium and radioactivity, the radiation sickness that is happening within my body. But ultimately, she denied the wounds, and she has gradually became the most famous personality, the famous woman during his lifetime. And ultimately, again, the same phrase was being repeated in the last two lines. Here it wrote, denying her wounds came from the same source. You know, there is the twist is there. That means it came from the same source as a power. That means from where the power comes, from that particular perspective, the power, that is the radium or radioactivity. So the power is being incorporating in different orientations. I should say here that the ultimately the intellectual power that I have mentioned in my previous section, that the intellectual power to discover physical power made her a woman of nearly unparalleled fame and power. This is not a typical formation of a Foucauldian power, as you can see. It reminds us of philosophy. And Rich reminds us in poetics, power is not something one can possess, but it is instead a relationship between entities that determines knowledge, discourse, and constitutes our identities and social realities. We can direct and influence power, but we cannot control it. Curie discovered the effects of radioactivity and helped to channel its own or its use toward the productive means. But she herself couldn't control uh, it properly or keep it from infecting her. For Rich, these relationships of power are inherent in patriarchy. Patriarchy builds civilization, but its cost has been the subjugation of billions of gender, racial, race, or class, and sexual minorities, generation after generation. It is happening, you see. Ultimately, we all actually, like Curie at the end of the poem, are left denying our wounds. Denying our wounds came from the same source as our power. We bear the scars of civilization's oppressive foundation, but we actually powder over them, you see. We talk of democracy, humanitarianism, and spiritually preferring to dwell on the powers it has given us instead of those that have been taken away. Yet you will find Rich knew that to these institutions, like the state and patriarchy that grant us freedom on paper, but endeavor to restrain us in this practice. Rich articulated the inner workings of power and revealed that power relations exercised by social institutions. The poem is an example of Rich's perception of the differences between male opportunism and female devotion to work. Rich's poem revisits history to reconstruct two opposing views of power, one illegitimate and self centered, and the other legitimate because it is selfless. The poem begins with the narrative of the great value that one bottle amber brings to cure fever or even a cold, and there is also an emphasis on how it's cured that lies within the art deposit of our history. The subjectivity of the poem slowly changes to Mary Curie, and ultimately, in this particular way, it is actually going. You will find that Rich's poem involves around the later years of the life of scientist Marie Curie. And fundamentally, the poem is therefore indicating the various kinds of resources, the various kinds of, uh, say, fundamental knowledge that we can gather from, at one point, Marie Curie's life, and from another point, it is the societal subjugations and societal exploitations that the females are feeling at this moment. So that's why whenever you will go through this particular poem, Power, you will fundamentally think about the concept of power, that is the significance of the title, the various kinds of power that the poem is literally incorporating, and at the same time, you have to bring the association of the societal perspectives that is in work. Okay. Similarly, you will find that whenever you will deal with this particular poem, some feminist associations are always in work. As I have already told you, the text is not simply describing a particular kind of an invention that is made by Adrienne Rich, but at the same time, you have to keep it in mind that it is metaphorically or symbolically, it is representing something else. It is focusing on the conditions of a female in a typical society, in a typical patriarchal backdrop. So that is why the poem have to be considered. The poem has to be considered as a good example of the fundamental focus on the patriarchal subjugations and the feminist agenda that is in work. So you have to comment on the poem that is Power in a detailed form. You have to comment on the central idea of the poem. You have to identify the basic tone of this particular poem and also the feminist aspect that is in work. And at the same time, you have to identify the theme of power that is always in work in this particular poem. So try to go in this poem line by line, try to identify the typical serious agenda that the poem is actually focusing at, and try to identify and try to write the answers on the topics and the questions that have been mentioned just now. So stay attached today after this. I hope this particular lecture or these 3 lectures at a row, it will help you in answering this particular poem, Power by Adrienne Rich. Thank you.